Hello, friends, and welcome to Coached by Tara, aka CBT, the podcast where Tara,
Hi, that's
I
me.
just punched my microphone, coaches me, hi, I'm Mike, on things that I don't know because I'm a big dumb man.
No.
And this week and the last couple, the whole time this has existed, we've been doing Twilight. Right now we're on New Moon, and we're going into Chapter 3 this week. This is kind of like a weird book club that we named after a sexual act. So if you're into that, read along with us, have a good time. It's fun. If you're not into that,
It's basically me just reading it, but we analyzed it as well.
basically this is like an audio book, but it's Tara's voice, so it's Pog, and also she skips the parts that aren't important.
Yeah, I
She
skip
just
a lot of
glosses over 'em.
just a lot. Yeah, I gloss.
So anyway, last week we did Chapter 2, which was Stitches, my favorite Shawn Mendes song. And basically, this chapter gave us some Edward lore. It gave us some Edward lore. It gave us
Edward
vampire babies. Look out for vampire babies. We learned
No,
about the
it really
the
didn't give any
the
vampire
Van Bussy.
babies.
We got the Van Bussy. But basically, Carlisle told us about why he created Edward and how he handles, basically dealing with all the patients that he deals with all the time, as he stitched Bella up and removed all the glass from her arm that Edward had pushed her in the previous chapter. Everybody kind of calmed down. But that most of the chapter was dedicated to that lore. Then and as to why Edward wouldn't want to turn Bella, which was because he believes the vampires do not have souls, and so by turning her into a vampire or letting her be turned into a vampire, he'd be possibly taking her soul and not allowing her to get into whatever afterlife she believes in. And so that's obviously a big deal to him because he loves her. And, that's a big thing to do even if you don't love somebody. Like, hey, I'm going to take your soul. Kind of messed
Yeah,
up.
kind of messed up.
So we basically learned about that, and then they went home, and she opened the rest of her gifts with Edward. One was a couple plane tickets to Jacksonville to see her mom, which was nice. And then the other one was a CD CD's nuts, a CD of songs that he's composed, including her lullaby, played on piano for her, and she cried and loved it. And then as they were getting ready for bed, he kissed her in a way more passionate way than he typically does. And she remembered that the last time he kissed her like that, it's because he didn't know when the next time he was going to see her was. And so she started to get worried before she fell asleep, like, wait a minute, what's going on here? A little bit of foreshadowing. So, Tara, now that I've recapped Chapter 2, Stitches, what is this next chapter called?
This next chapter is called The End.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
Yeah.
Not like this. So, my prediction is that they're going to break up. And it's going to be like she's not going to be into it, but he is. It's going to be a bit painful. Not in a physical sense, but more in a emotional and mental sense. That's my prediction.
All right.
And that if you own Simp Mike's stock, don't buy it. Still sell it. What are you doing? There's no way it's going to be Simp Mike that's going to take the spot.
No.
Why did you buy it in the first place? That was a terrible investment. I don't know why anybody would tell you to buy Simp Mike stock. He's never going to get with Bella. Sorry, Simp Mike Truthers. Anyway, let's take a break, Tara, and when we come back, we'll get into chapter 3, the end.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
Yay. All right, Tara. I am ready to be coached.
All right, let's do it.
Coach me, mommy.
So, the chapter begins where she feels like absolutely disgusting in the morning. Like she didn't sleep well, and her arm burned, and her head hurt, and like it didn't like help that like when Edward left, he just was like kissed her forehead and just like left, and she was like afraid that the time that she'd spent sleeping, that he'd been like thinking too much about right and wrong while he was sleeping, and she was just like really anxious. And he was waiting for her at school still as normal, but like his face to her still felt like wrong, and like that she was like being kept something from him, or that he was keeping something from her.
Mhm. Mhm.
And he asked how she felt, and she's like, "I feel fine." And but her head was still like hurting, and like everything was just like not good. And but there were so many questions that she wanted to ask, but they were walking in silence to class anyways. Like she wanted to know how Jasper was, and if he was still gone, and like what everyone had said, and why he was still like so like moody and like all this stuff. But they hadn't really said anything to each other, and they just like went to their classes. And she felt like the morning was passing by slowly because like they go to their classes together, and then they have lunch with more people. But he kind of just remains aloof and asks her about her arm, and she just continues to lie and say it's fine. And she's like, well, Alice usually beats me to lunch, like maybe there'll be something that she has to tell me. They get to the lunch table because Alice usually beats them and brings like a tray of food. But when they get to the lunch table, it's only Connor and Ben, who are in her fourth hour French class, that are sitting at the table. And she goes, "Well, where's Alice?" And he looks at the granola bar. He was just like crushing in his fingertips, like where because nobody was paying attention. And he's like, "Well, she's with Jasper." And she finally asks, "Is he okay?" And he says he's gone away for a while. And she goes, "What? Where?" And Edward says, "Well, nowhere in particular." "And Alice, too?" I said with quiet desperation. Of course, if Jasper needed her, she would go. "Yes, she'll be gone for a while." She was trying to convince him to go to Denali. Denali was the one other band of unique vampires, good ones like the Cohens, lived. Tanya and her family. I'd heard of them every now and again. Edward had run to them last winter when my arrival had made Forks difficult for him. Laurent, the most civilized member of James's little coven, had gone there rather than siding with James against the Cullens.
Laurent.
Yeah. It made
Uh-huh.
sense for Alice to try to encourage Jasper to go there. I swallowed, trying to dislodge the sudden lump in my throat. The guilt made my head bow and my shoulders slump. I'd run them out of their home just like Rosalie and Emmett. I was a plague. "Is your arm bothering you?" he asked. "Who cares about my stupid arm?" I muttered in disgust. He didn't answer, and I put my head down on the table. By the end of the day, the silence was becoming ridiculous. I didn't want to be the one to break it, but apparently that was my only choice if I ever wanted him to talk to me again. "You'll come over later tonight?" I asked. He walked me silently to my truck. Later? I asked again. It pleased me that he seemed surprised. I Oh, he asked later.
Mm.
And he, it pleased me that he had seemed surprised. I have to work. I had to trade with Mrs. Newton to get yesterday off. Oh, he murmured, like he thought he was coming over right now. So you'll come over when I'm home, though, right? I hated that I felt suddenly unsure about this. If you want me to. I always want you, I reminded him, with perhaps a little more intensity than the conversation required. I expected he would laugh or smile or react somehow to my words. All right, then, he said indifferently. He kissed my forehead again before he shut the door on me. I was able to drive out of the parking lot before the panic really hit, but I was hyperventilating by the time I got to the Newtons. He just needed time, I told myself. He would get over this. Maybe he was sad because his family was disappearing. But Alice and Jasper would come back soon, and Rosalie and Emmett, too. If it would help, I would stay away from the big white house on the river. I'd never set foot there again. That didn't matter. I'd still see Alice at school. She would have to come back for school, right? And she was at my place all the time, anyways. She wouldn't want to hurt Charlie's feelings by staying away. No doubt I would also run into Carlisle with regularity in the emergency room. After all, what happened last night was nothing. Nothing had happened, so I fell down. That was the story of my life. Compared to last spring, it seemed especially unimportant. James had left me broken and nearly dead from loss of blood, and yet Edward had handled the interminable, I don't know how to say that word, I just realized, interminable weeks in the
Interminable.
hospital much better than this. Was it because this time it wasn't an enemy he'd had to protect me from? Maybe because it was his own brother? Maybe it would be better if he took me away. So she's just like reasoning with herself this whole
Right,
time.
right.
Rather than his family being scattered. I grew slightly less depressed as I considered all the uninterrupted time alone. If he could just last through the school year, Charlie wouldn't be able to object. We could go away to college or pretend that's what we were doing, like Rosalie and Emmett this year. Surely Edward could wait a year. What was a year to an immortal? It didn't even seem like that much to me. I was able to talk myself into enough composure to handle getting out of the truck and walking to the store. So she's finally like, okay, well, I'm fine.
Time to go to work.
And Mike beat her there, and they just are working together. And she's just like still thinking about like all the places that her and Edward could run away to. And then he comes over and asks about her birthday, and she's like, well, I'm just glad it's over. And he's just like looking at her like she's crazy. Like he's just like, okay, well, bye.
Yeah, okay, psycho.
And work dragged by, and she just wanted to, get back to home because she was like, I just want to see Edward. And she felt a lot of relief when she parks on her street, or when she goes onto her street and Edward's car is parked in front of their house. So that's good. And then she goes in the house and she's like, Dad, Edward. And they both are just like looking at the TV, like, but Charlie's focusing on it and Edward's like not because he's like, whatever.
Right.
And he goes, Hey, Bella, we just had cold pizza. I think it's still on the table. It says, I waited in the doorway. Finally, Edward looked over at me with a polite smile. I'll be right behind you. His eyes strayed back to the TV. I stared for another moment, shocked. Neither one seemed to notice. I could feel something, panic maybe, building up in my chest. I escaped to the kitchen. So she was like, What? This feels so weird?
Mhm.
The pizza held no interest to me. I sat in the chair, pulled my knees up, and wrapped my arms around them. Something was wrong, maybe more wrong than I'd realized. The sound of male bonding and banter continued from the TV set. What's the worst that can happen? I flinched. That was definitely the wrong question to ask myself. I was having a hard time breathing right. Okay, I thought again, what's the worst I can live through? I didn't like that question so much either, but I thought through the possibilities I considered today. Staying away from Edward's family, of course. He wouldn't expect Alice to be part of that. But if Jasper was off limits, that would lessen the time I could have with her. I nodded to myself. I could live with that. Or going away. Maybe he wouldn't want to wait till the end of the school year. Maybe it would have to be now. In front of me on the table, my presents from Charlie and Renee were where I had left them, the camera I hadn't had the chance to use, sitting beside the album. I touched the pretty cover of the scrapbook my mother had given me, thinking of Renee. Somehow, living without her for as long as I had did not make the idea of a more permanent separation easier. and Charlie would be left here all alone, abandoned. They would both be so hurt. But we'd come back, right? We'd visit, of course, wouldn't we? So she's still like back in that like panicked
Right.
thing.
She's freaking out.
So she's just like looking at the scrapbook and like she's like, "Oh, like maybe it was a good idea to get a scrapbook. Like I should really be like putting pictures in here." And she was like, "I just want to get started. Like I should get started putting pictures in here." And she put the camera on her wrist and she looks at the or she's like wondering about that first picture. Remember she took it of Edward. Could it possibly turn out anything close to the original? I doubted it, but he didn't seem worried that it would be blank. I chuckled to myself thinking of his carefree laughter last night. The chuckle died away. So much had changed and so abruptly. It made me feel a little bit dizzy that I was standing on an edge, a precipice somewhere much too high. So she's like, "Oh, like I shouldn't be like she's still like I shouldn't be worried, but like I still feel like I'm on an edge
Right.
basically." She just grabs her camera and goes upstairs. And then she's thinking about how her room hasn't changed in the years since her mom had been there, basically, and she takes a picture of it just so that she has a picture of her room for some reason. She's like just wanting to take pictures of everything. And she takes her time coming back downstairs. She took pictures of other things, I think, too. Trying to ignore the butterflies in my stomach as I thought of the strange distance I didn't want to see in Edward's eyes. He would get over this. He was probably worried that I would be upset when he asked me to leave. I would let him work through it without meddling, and I would be prepared when he asked. I had the camera ready as I leaned around the corner, being sneaky. I was sure there was no chance that I had caught Edward by surprise, but he didn't look up. I felt a brief shiver as something icy twisted in my stomach. I ignored that and took the picture. They both looked at me then. Charlie frowned. "What are you doing, Bella?" "Oh, come on," I pretended to smile as I went to the floor, sit on the floor in front of the sofa where Charlie was at. "You know Mom will be calling soon to ask if I'm using my presents. I have to get my to work before she can get her feelings hurt." "Why are you taking pictures of me, though?" he grumbled. "Because you're so handsome," I replied, "and because since you brought the camera, you're obligated to be one of my subjects." He mumbled something unintelligible. "Hey, Edward," I said with admirable indifference, "take one of me and my dad together." I threw the camera toward him, carefully avoiding his eyes, and knelt beside the arm of the sofa where Charlie's face was. Charlie sighed. "You need to smile, Bella," Edward murmured. I did my best, and the camera flashed. "Let me take one of you kids," Charlie suggested. I knew he was trying to shift the camera's focus from himself. Edward stood and lightly tossed him the camera. I went to stand beside Edward, and the arrangement felt formal and strange to me. He put one hand lightly on my shoulder, and I wrapped my arm more securely around his waist. I wanted to look at his face, but I was afraid to. "Smile, Bella," Charlie reminded me again. I took a deep breath and smiled. The flash blinded me. So then they just started taking pictures, and Charlie's like, "That's enough. Like, you don't have to use the whole roll right now." Back when there's film rolls,
Right.
lol.
Film rolls. LOL.
So then they're like, Edward drops his hand from his shoulder and like twists like away from her like arm basically and sits back down in the armchair like where he can sit on his own. And she's just like so anxious. She's like, "What the heck?" And then she sees him stand up and he says like, "I better get home." And Charlie's like, "Okay, bye. Like, see ya." Like
See you, bud.
casual.
Thanks for hanging out.
And she's like, "Will you stay?" And he says, "Not tonight." And she didn't ask for a reason. So then she, like, follows him out there to see him, like, walk away, and she didn't notice that it was raining, and she was just, like, watching him drive away, and Charlie's like, "What are you doing?" And she was just, like, standing there dripping wet, and she was like, "Oh, nothing," like, then she just, like, goes in and then goes to bed, and it's, like, the next day, basically.
Rough.
Yeah, and so she didn't get much sleep, and she dresses for school mechanically, and she's just, like, it's just, like, robot feelings right now, I feel like, for her. It's basically how they describe it. Like, she eats a bowl of cereal, that she takes her camera with her because she wants to take pictures now, So she takes pictures of her truck in the forest in front of, and then like the front of the house. And notes how like the forest doesn't seem like sinister like it used to. Like she was like, the greenness of it all is like comforting to her. and she notes that she would miss it, like, if they have to leave together. And then she puts her camera in her bag and she tries to, like, focus on, like, what she comes up with, like, her new project of, like, taking the photos rather than, like, Edward being strange last night.
Right.
And she's, like, getting impatient, though. She's like, "How long can this last? Like, how long can we act like this?" Basically. And it still lasted through the morning. Like, he just was silent to her. She concentrated on her classes, and at lunch, like, he basically didn't say anything. And she was like, I just feel like screaming at any moment, basically, because it's like, what is going on? Like, so much so, like, she distracts herself by crossing, like, that invisible line by talking to someone else at the table at lunch besides Edward. Because remember how in that first chapter, they're
Yeah,
like,
they said that, like, there's an
everyone
invisible
sits on
line,
one side, basically.
and then when Edward and them don't come to school, then it's more normal.
Yeah. And she just says, like, "Hey, Jess," and she speaks to Jessica. And she says, "What's up, Bella? Could you do me a favor?" I asked. "My mom wants me to take some pictures of my friends for a scrapbook. So take some pictures of everybody, okay?" I handed her the camera. "Sure," she said, grinning, and turned to snap a candid shot of Mike with his mouth full of food. A predictable picture war ensued. I watched them hand the camera around the table, giggling and flirting and complaining about being on film. It seemed strangely childish to me. Maybe I just wasn't in the mood for normal human behavior today. And then Jessica, like, hands her the camera back and is like, "I think we used all your film. Whoops," kind of thing. And she's like, "That's okay. I think I already got all the pictures of everything else I needed so far." And then they fast forward to after school, and he walks her back to her car again. And she has to work again, and she's glad. She's like, "I just want to do something that's distracting to her." And she drops her film off at the store on the way to her work. She picks up the developed pictures already after work. So she gets home and she says hi to Charlie, and then she just goes up to her room to take a look at the photos because she's, like, really curious because she really doesn't know what's gonna be on
And
them.
Edward isn't in the picture.
Well, no,
Oh.
that's what she thinks. So says, "Ridiculously, I still have expected the first print to be a blank. When I pulled it out I gasped aloud. Edward looked just as beautiful as he did in real life, staring at me out of the picture with the warm eyes I'd missed for the past few days. It was almost uncanny that anyone could look so beyond description. No thousand words could equal this picture. I flipped through the rest of the stack quickly once, and then laid three of them out on the bed side by side. The first picture, the first was the picture of Edward in the kitchen, his warm eyes touched with tolerant amusement. The second was Edward and Charlie watching ESPN. The difference in Edward's expression was severe. His eyes were careful here, reserved. Still as breathtakingly beautiful, but his face was colder, more like a sculpture and less alive. The last picture was the picture of Edward and me standing awkwardly side by side. Edward's face was the same as the last, cold and statue-like. But that wasn't the most troubling part of this photograph. The contrast between the two of us was painful. He looked like a god. I looked very average, even for a human, almost shamefully plain. I flipped the picture over with a feeling of disgust. Instead of doing my homework, I stayed up to put my pictures into my album. With a ballpoint pen, I scrawled captions under the pictures and the names and the dates. I took the picture of Edward and me, and without looking at it too long, I folded it in half and stuck it under the metal tab, Edward side up, so she just, like, folded herself out of the photo. When I was done, I stuffed the second set of prints in a fresh envelope and penned a long thank you letter to Renee. And so she's still waiting for Edward to come over after that, and he's, like, never stayed away or, like, at least never called, and he never comes. So then she goes to sleep again and doesn't sleep well again because she's like, "What the heck?" Like, so days are going on where they feel weird, right?
Right.
And then they're on this still on this, like, silent pattern, like, he's still showing up and still being polite and still doing all these things, but, like, and, like, she feels relief when she sees him, but it fades quickly because she's like, This is nothing. This is nothingness. Like, we're not doing anything. Like, he's not saying anything." And at that point, to her, it's hard. to even remember, like, the reason for why it's all happening. She's like, "It doesn't even feel like that big of a thing to me anymore." Like, her birthday and, like, it just feels like so much in the past, and, like, maybe things would get better if Alice came back, but she knows she can't count on that. She doesn't, like, know about any of that because they haven't talked really, and if she couldn't get anything out of him today, she, like, says to herself that she's going to see Carlisle tomorrow. Like, she's like, "I don't know what else to do." Like, I'm just gonna like, she reasons with herself, like, "I need to go speak to him tomorrow if I don't hear about anyone else in the family today." After school, Edward and I were going to talk it out, I promised myself. I wasn't accepting any excuses. He walked me to my truck, so they're already at the end of the day, and I steeled myself to make my demands. "Do you mind if I come over today?" he asked before we got back to the truck, beating me to the punch. "Of course not." "Now?" he asked again, opening my door for me. "Sure," I kept my voice even, though I didn't like the urgency in his tone. "I was just going to drop a letter for Nate in the mailbox on the way. I'll meet you there." He looked at the fat envelope on the passenger seat. Suddenly, he reached over me and snagged it. "I'll do it," he said quietly, "and I'll still beat you there." He smiled my favorite crooked smile, but it was wrong. It didn't reach his eyes. "Okay," I agreed, unable to smile back. He shut the door and headed toward his car. He did beat me home. He was parked in Charlie's spot when I pulled up in the front of the house. That was a bad sign. He didn't plan to stay then. I shook my head and took a deep breath, trying to locate some courage. He got out of his car when I stepped out of the truck and came to meet me. He reached to take my book bag from me. That was normal, but he shoved it back onto the seat. That was not normal. "Come for a walk with me," he suggested in an unemotional voice, taking my hand. I didn't answer. I couldn't think of a way to protest, but I instantly knew that I wanted to. I didn't like this. "This is bad. This is very bad," the voice in my head repeated again and again. But he didn't wait for an answer. He pulled me along toward the east side of the yard where the forest encroached the yard. I followed unwillingly, trying to think through the panic. It was what I wanted, I reminded myself, the chance to talk it all through. So why was the panic choking me? We'd only gone a few steps into the trees when he stopped. We were barely on the trail. I could still see the house from here. Some walk. Edward leaned against a tree and stared at me, his expression unreadable. "Okay, let's talk," I said. It sounded braver than it felt. He took a breath, a deep breath. "Bella, we're leaving." I took a deep breath too. This was an acceptable option. I thought I was prepared, but I still had to ask. "Why now? Another year?" "Bella, it's time. How much longer could we stay in Forks after all? Carlisle can barely pass for 30, and he's claiming 33 now. We'd have to start over soon regardless." His answer confused me. I thought the point of leaving was to let his family live in peace. Why did we have to leave if they were going? I stared at him, trying to understand what he meant. He stared back coldly. With a roll of nausea, I realized I'd misunderstood.
You ain't going with Bella.
"When you say we," I whispered, "I mean my family and myself," each word separate and distinct. I shook my head back and forth mechanically, trying to clear it. He waited without any sign of impatience. It took a few minutes before I could speak. "Okay," I said. "I'll come with you." "You can't, Bella. Where we're going, it's not the right place for you. Where you are is the right place for me. I'm no good for you, Bella. Don't be ridiculous." I wanted to sound angry, but it was just sounding like I was begging. "You're the very best part of my life." "My world is not for you," he said grimly. "What happened with Jasper? That was nothing, Edward. Nothing." "You're right," he agreed. "It was exactly what was to be expected. You promised. In Phoenix, you promised you would stay. As long as that was what was best for you," he interrupted to correct me. "No, this is about my soul, isn't it?" I shouted, furious, the words exploding out of me. Somehow it still sounded like a plea. "Carlisle told me about that, and I don't care, Edward. I don't care. You can have my soul. I don't want it without you. It's yours already." This is a very heavy part.
This is very, very heavy.
He took a deep breath and stared unseeingly at the ground for a long moment. His mouth twisted the tiniest bit. When he finally looked up, his eyes were different, harder, like the liquid gold had frozen solid. Bella, I don't want you to come with me. He spoke the words slowly and precisely, his cold eyes on my face, watching as I absorbed what he was really saying. There was a pause as I repeated the words in my head a few times, sifting through them for their real intent. You don't want me? I tried out the words, confused by the way they sounded, placed in that order. No. I stared, uncomprehending, into his eyes. He stared back without apology. His eyes were like topaz, hard and clear and very deep. I felt like I could see into them for miles and miles, yet nowhere in their bottomless depths could I see contradiction to the words he had spoken. While that changes things, I was surprised by how calm and reasonable my voice sounded. It must be because I was so numb. I couldn't realize what he was telling me. It still didn't make any sense. He looked away into the trees as he spoke again. Of course, I'll always love you, in a way, but what happened the other night made me realize that it's time for a change. Because I'm tired of pretending to be something I'm not, Bella. I'm not human. He looked back, and the icy planes of his perfect face were not human. I've let this go on much too long, and I'm sorry for that. Don't. My voice was just a whisper now. Awareness was beginning to seep through me, trickling like acid through my veins. Don't do this. He just stared at me, and I could see from his eyes that my words were far too late. He already had. You're not good for me, Bella. He turned his earlier words around, and so I had no argument. How well I knew that I wasn't good enough for him. I opened my mouth to say something and then closed it again. He waited patiently, his face wiped clean of all emotion. I tried again. If that's what you want. He nodded once. My whole body went numb. I couldn't feel anything below the neck. I would like to ask one favor, though, if that's not too much, he said. I wonder what he saw on my face, because something flickered across his own face in response. But before I could identify it, he'd composed his features into the same serene mask as before. Anything, I vowed, my voice faintly stronger. As I watched, his frozen eyes melted. The gold became liquid again, molten, burning down into mine with an intensity that was overwhelming. Don't do anything reckless or stupid, he ordered, no longer detached. Do you understand what I'm saying? I nodded helplessly. His eyes cooled again, the distance returning to them. I'm thinking of Charlie, of course. He needs you. Take care of yourself. For him. I nodded again. I will, I whispered. He seemed to relax just a little. And I'll make you a promise in return, he said. I promise that this will be the last time you'll see me. I won't come back. I won't put you through anything like this ever again. You can go on with your life without any more interference from me. It will be as if I've never existed. My knees must have started to shake because the trees were suddenly wobbling. I could hear the blood pounding faster than normal behind my ears. His voice sounded farther away. He smiled gently. Don't worry. You're human. Your memory is no more than a sieve. Time heals all wounds for your kind. And your memories? I asked. It sounded like there was something stuck in my throat, like I was choking. Well, he hesitated for a short second. I won't forget. But my kind were very easily distracted. He smiled. The smile was tranquil, and it did not touch his eyes. He took a step away from me. That's everything, I suppose. We won't bother you again. The plural caught my attention. That surprised me. I would have thought I was beyond noticing anything. Alice isn't coming back, I realized. I don't know how he heard me. The words made barely any sound, but he seemed to understand. He shook his head slowly, always watching my face. No, they're all gone. I stayed behind to tell you goodbye. Alice is gone? My voice was blank with disbelief. She wanted to say goodbye, but I convinced her that a clean break would be better for you. I was dizzy. It was hard to concentrate. His words swirled around my head, and I heard the doctor at the hospital in Phoenix last spring as he showed me the x-rays. You can see it's a clean break, his finger traced along the picture of my severed bone. That's good. It will heal more easily, more quickly. I tried to breathe normally. I needed to concentrate to find a way out of this nightmare. Goodbye, Bella, he said in the same quiet, peaceful voice. Wait, I choked out the word, reaching for him, willing my deadened legs to carry me forward. I thought he was reaching for me too, but his cold hands locked around my wrists and pinned them to my sides. He leaned down and pressed his lips very lightly to my forehead for the briefest instant. My eyes closed. Take care of yourself, he breathed, cool against my skin. There was a light, unnatural breeze. My eyes flashed open. The leaves on a small vine maple shuddered with the gentle wind of his passage. He was gone. It's not the end of the chapter, but
Wow.
I know.
Wow, wow, wow.
Lots right
So
there.
rude.
And it's a lot.
So
It's so hard
rude.
for me to read. It's so sad.
So rude, Edward.
Yeah.
So rude.
So then she tries like a useless attempt to follow him but his path like had already disappeared, you know.
Mhm.
There's no footprints. The leaves were still again. There's basically nothing she could do. And she's like, love, life, meaning over. She walks and walks through the woods, and it feels like hours passing, but it's only seconds. Maybe it felt like time had frozen because the forest looked the same no matter how far I went. I started to worry that I was traveling in a circle, a very small circle at that, but I kept going. I stumbled often, and as it grew darker and darker, I fell often too. Finally, I tripped over something. It was black now. I had no idea what caught my foot, and I had stayed down. I rolled onto my side so that I could breathe, and curled up on the wet bracken. As I lay there, I had a feeling that more time was passing than I realized, so she's literally just laying on the ground of the woods. I couldn't remember how long it had been since nightfall. Was it always so dark here at night? Surely, as a rule, some little bit of moonlight would filter down through the clouds, through the chinks in the canopies of the trees, and find the ground. Not tonight. Tonight the sky was utterly black. Perhaps there was no moon tonight, a lunar eclipse, a new moon. A new moon. I shivered, though I wasn't cold. It was black for a long time before I heard them calling. Someone was shouting my name. It was muted and muffled by the wet growth that surrounded me, but it was definitely my name. I didn't even recognize the voice. I thought about answering, but I was dazed, and it took a long time to come to the conclusion that I should answer. By then, the calling had stopped. Sometime later, the rain woke me up. I don't think I'd really fallen asleep. I was lost in an unthinking stupor, holding with all my strength to the numbness that kept me from realizing what I didn't want to know. The rain bothered me a little. It was cold. Unwrapped my arms from around my legs to cover my face. It was then that I heard the calling again. It was farther away this time, and sometimes it sounded like several voices were calling at once. Would I be able to shout loud enough? Suddenly, there was another sound, I can't say that word. Startlingly,
Startling?
yes,
Startling.
Lee.
Startlingly.
Startlingly close.
Startlingly close. Startlingly.
A kind of snuffling and animal sound. It sounded big. I wondered if I should feel afraid. I didn't. Just numb. It didn't matter. The snuffling went away. The rain, basically, it's just like people are looking for her and she's just like
She
too
doesn't
numb to
care. She
care.
doesn't care.
Finally, the light broke through the closest brush, and the brightness blinded me for a moment. Bella. The voice was deep and unfamiliar, but full of recognition. He wasn't calling my name to search. He was acknowledging that I was found. I stared up, impossibly high it seemed, at the dark face that I could now see above me. I was vaguely aware that the stranger probably only looked so tall because my head was still on the ground. Have you been hurt? I knew the words meant something, but I could only stare, bewildered. How could the meaning matter at this point? Bella, my name is Sam Yulee. There was nothing familiar about his name. Charlie sent me to look for you. Charlie? That struck a chord, and I paid more attention to what he was saying. Charlie mattered, if nothing else did. So basically, he held out his hand, and after that, he just is like trying to pull her up to the ground, or up, yeah, standing up into the ground, and he basically just like carries her at that point because she's like too like she's like a limp noodle.
Right.
She knows like some part of her should be upset that she's being carried by a stranger, but she's not. And he just yells like that he has her. And like he's explaining to other people that he doesn't think that she's hurt, but she just keeps saying he's gone. Was I saying that out loud? I bit down on my lip. So she didn't even know she was like repeating to herself like that he was gone. Bella, honey, are you all right? That was the one voice I would know anywhere, even distorted as it was now with worry. Charlie? My voice sounded strange and small. I'm right here, baby. There was a shifting under me, followed by the leathery smell of my dad's sheriff jacket. Charlie staggered under my weight. Maybe I should hold on to her, Samuel suggested. I've got her, Charlie said, a little breathless, so he picked her up now. He walked slowly, struggling. I wish I could tell him to put me down and let me walk, but I couldn't find my voice. We're almost home now, honey, Charlie mumbled now and then. I opened my eyes again when I heard the door unlock. We were on the porch of our house, and the tall, dark man named Sam was holding the door for Charlie, one arm extended toward us as if he was preparing to catch me when Charlie's arms failed. Dad, I'm all wet, I objected feebly. He tries to put her on the couch. That doesn't matter, his voice was gruff. And then he was talking to someone else. Blankets are in the cupboard at the top of the stairs. Bella? A new voice asked. I looked at the gray-haired man leaning over me. Dr. Grandy? I mumbled. That's right, dear. Are you hurt, Bella? It took me a minute to think that through. I was confused by the memory of Samuel's similar question in the woods. Have you been hurt? He'd said. The difference seemed significant somehow. I'm not hurt, I lied. The words were true enough for what he had asked. His warm hand touched my forehead, and his fingers pressed against the inside of my wrist. I watched his lips tick as he counted to himself, his eyes on his watch. What happened to you? He asked casually. I froze under his hand, tasting panic in the back of my throat. Did you get lost in the woods? He prodded. I was aware of several other people listening, tall, three more tall men with dark faces from La Push, Qui- the Quaalude Indian. I think that's how you say it, Quaalude Indian
Is
reservation.
is that how we decided it was said? We did this last book
I know
too.
I never
Quaalude.
Quaalude, Quaalude,
Hold
Quaalude
on.
on the coastline, I guess. Sam Yulia among them were standing very close together and staring at me. Mr. Newton was there with Mike and Mr. Weber, Angela's father. They were all watching me more surreptitiously than the strangers, so they all were looking. Half the town must have been looking for me, she says.
Native American names too, so make sure to stay tuned and consider subscribing for more learning. They are a Native American people in Western Washington state in the United States. How do you say it? Quileute. Quileute. Pretty straightforward.
Quaalude.
Quaalude.
Thank you to
Thank you too.
Julian Miguel on YouTube. Go subscribe.
So Charlie was the closest one to her. Stop laughing. That's not a funny chapter to laugh at.
I mean that
I know
video was
that
funny.
video was funny. Yes, she answered. I got lost. Do you feel tired? Dr. Grandy asked. I nodded and closed my eyes obediently. I don't think there's anything wrong with her, I heard the doctor mutter to Charlie after a moment. Just exhaustion. Let her sleep it off, and I'll come check on her tomorrow. Well, later today, actually, so it must have been like really late already.
Right.
Is it true? Charlie whispered. Their voices were farther away now. I strained to hear. Did they leave? Dr. Cullen asked us not to say anything. Dr. Grandy answered. The offer was very sudden. They had to choose immediately. Carlyle didn't want to make a big production out of leaving. A little warning might have been nice, Charlie grumbled. Dr. Grandy sounded uncomfortable when he replied, Yes, well, In this situation, some warning might have been called for. I didn't want to listen anymore. I felt for the edge of the quilt someone had laid on top of me, and I pulled it over my ear. I drifted in and out of alertness. I heard Charlie whisper thanks to the volunteers as one by one they left. I felt his fingers on my forehead and then the weight of another blanket. The phone rang a few times, and he hurried to catch it before it could wake me. He muttered reassurances in a low voice to the callers. Yeah, we found her. She's okay. She got lost. She's fine now. I heard the springs in the armchair groan when he settled himself in for the night. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. Charlie moaned as he struggled to his feet, and then he rushed, stumbling, to the kitchen. I pulled my head under the blankets, not wanting to listen to the same conversation once again. Yeah, Charlie said. His voice changed. It was much more alert than when he had spoken again. When he spoke again. Where? There was a pause. You're sure it's outside the reservation? Another short pause. But what could be burning out there? He looked both worried and mystified. Look, I'll call down there and check it out. I listened with more interest as he punched in a number. Hey, Billy, it's Charlie. Sorry I'm calling so early. No, she's fine. She's sleeping. Thanks, but that's not why I called. I just got a call from Mrs. Stanley, and she says that from her second story window she could see fires out on the sea cliffs. But I didn't really. Oh, suddenly there was an edge in his voice, irritation or anger. And why are they doing that? Uh huh. Really? He said sarcastically. Well, don't apologize to me. Yeah, just make sure the flames don't spread. I know. I'm surprised they got them all lit at all in this winter. Charlie hesitated and then added, Thanks for sending Sam and the other boys up. You were right. They do know the forest better than we do. It was Sam who found her, so I owe you one. Yeah, I'll talk to you later. Charlie muttered something incoherent as he shuffled back to the living room. What's wrong? I asked. He hurried to my side. I'm sorry I woke you, honey. Is something burning? It's nothing, he assured me. Just some bonfires out on the cliffs. Bonfires? I asked. My voice didn't sound curious. It sounded dead. Charlie frowned. Some of the kids from the reservation were being rowdy, he explained. Why? I wondered dully. I couldn't. I could tell he didn't want to answer. He looked at the floor under his knees. They're celebrating the news. His tone was bitter. There was only one piece of news I could think of, try as I might not to. And then the pieces snapped together. Because the Cullens left, I whispered. They don't like the Cullens in La Push. I'd forgotten about that. The Quaaludes had their superstitions about the cold ones, the blood drinkers that were enemies to their tribe, just like they had legends of the Great Flood and wolf men ancestors. Just stories, folklore to most of them. Then there were those that believed. Charlie's good friend Billy Black believed, though even Jacob, his own son, thought he was full of stupid superstitions. Billy had warned me to stay away from the Cullens. The name stirred something inside me, something that began to claw its way towards the surface, something I knew I didn't want to face. It's ridiculous, Charlie spluttered. We sat in silence for a moment. Somewhere behind the rain, the sun was beginning to rise. Bella, Charlie asked. I looked at him uneasily. He left you alone in the woods? Charlie guessed. I deflected his question. How did you know where to find me? My mind shied away from the inevitable awareness that was coming quickly now. Your note, Charlie answered, surprised. He reached into the back of his pocket of his jeans and pulled out a much abused piece of paper. It was dirty and damp with multiple creases from being opened and refolded many times from the night before. He unfolded it again and held it up as evidence. The messy handwriting was remarkably close to my own. Going for a walk with Edward up the path, it said, Back soon, B. So he forged it.
Right.
When you didn't come back, I called the Cullens and no answer. Then I called the hospital and Dr. Grandy told me that Carlisle was gone. Where did they go? I mumbled. He stared at me. Didn't Edward tell you? I shook my head, recoiling. The sound of his name unleashed the thing that was clawing inside me, a pain that knocked me breathless as astonished me with its force. Charlie eyed me doubtfully as he answered. Carlisle took a job with a big hospital in Los Angeles. I guess they threw a lot of money at him. Sunny LA. the last place they could really go. I remembered my nightmare with the mirror, the bright sunlight shimmering off his skin. Agony ripped through me with the memory of his face. I want to know if Edward left you alone out there in the middle of the woods, Charlie insisted. His name sent another wave of torture through me. I shook my head, frantic, desperate to escape the pain. It was my fault. He left me right here on the trail inside of the house, but I tried to follow him. Charlie started to say something. I covered my ears. I can't talk about this anymore, Dad. I want to go to my room. Before he could answer, I scrambled up from the couch and lurched my way up the stairs. Someone had been in the house to leave a note for Charlie, a note that would lead him to find me. From the minute that I had realized this, a horrible suspicion began to grow in my head. I rushed to my room, shutting and locking the door behind me before I ran to the CD player by my bed. Everything looked exactly the same as I'd left it. I pressed down on the CD player, the latch unhooked, and the lid slowly swung open. It was empty. The album Renee had given me sat on the floor beside the bed, just where I'd put it last. I lifted the cover with a shaking hand. I didn't have to flip any farther than the first page. The little metal corners no longer held a picture in place. The page was blank except for my own handwriting scrawled across the bottom. Edward Cullen, Charlie's Kitchen, September 13th. I stopped there. I was sure that he would have been very thorough. It will be as if I'd never existed, he'd promised me. I felt the smooth wooden floor beneath my knees, and then the palms of my hands, and then it was pressed against the skin of my cheek. I hoped that I was fainting, but to my disappointment, I didn't lose consciousness. The waves of pain that had only laughed at me before now reared high up and washed over my head, pulling me under. I did not resurface. And that's the end of the chapter.
What a terrible chapter of book.
And actually, I'm just going to kind of go over the next 4 chapters of this book because the next chapter is called October, and the next chapter is called November, and the next chapter is called December, and the next chapter is called
So
January.
for listeners out there and everybody, Tara literally just showed me 4 pages that are completely blank, but just with the months on them. So technically, the next chapter we have is chapter what?
I mean, it's technically still chapter 4, but
But they
make it very obvious that
that
October,
4 months
November,
pass.
December, and January have
Wow, wow,
passed.
wow. So there we go, ladies and gentlemen. That's just sad.
Yes.
Just made me sad.
I know, I'm really
I
sad.
didn't like talk as much or interject as much because I felt like it was a pretty emotionally poignant.
I
And
feel
for me
like
to like crack jokes about
yeah.
Charlie watching Skinamax didn't feel appropriate.
No.
So I kind of just let you do your thing. But yeah, that's sad.
It's horrible, isn't
What
it?
a and like
I feel
to
like
think that you as Edward are doing her any kind of mercy by leaving her that way is insane.
I feel like she like the author Stephanie Meyer does well with describing like the feeling of like a breakup, you know what I mean?
Yeah, the lead up to it was I thought was pretty believable
Yeah.
and I think we've all kind of felt that feeling before
Yes.
in our lives where something's off and you're like, "Ah, I'm probably just making it up," but it's definitely off. So, no, what yeah, wow, wow, wow. So, I guess
Yes.
I do like that we are jumping 4 months forward because we're gonna get a more hopefully adjusted Bella to what's going on. Because I don't know that I wanted to do another chapter for
Where it was
Halloween.
just really sad. I can't promise you that nothing won't be sad, but
Well, no, I'm not saying that, but just like
getting through that initial
if they were like, okay, the next day, and she's like, yeah, I hated myself because
Right.
Edward left because I'm in, you know what I mean? I'm comatose, and you know what I mean? It's just it's
I
good that
think
we're
they
jumping.
do, yeah, they could do it. She does a really great job of that. Like where you get the feeling that it obviously feels like time has passed probably slowly for her, but all at once as
Right,
well.
right, definitely. That maybe she's and this is predict predictory predictable
Archery.
predicting I'm predicting. But, like, those months, she all felt that same kinda numb, and maybe she's starting to break out of it a little bit, which is why we're catching up with her after that, would be my guess. So, anyway,
Sorry for the
Sorry
not
for the
so
bummer.
yeah, the bummer of a chapter, but had to get through that.
Yeah, so that was good. You guys can email us at coachbytara at
Yes.
gmail.com. Actually, it's Coach by Tara podcast, actually. Is it?
Yes, it is.
Is it? I think I said Yep, Coach by... No, it's CBTara podcast at gmail.com. Sorry. CBTara is the name of the email address at gmail.com. You can email us there. Or you can hit us up in the Discord, or like Tara usually is the one to say, but we are releasing these episodes a week early on Patreon.
Yes.
So if you're listening on there, thank you. If you're not, what are you doing?
You can get them a whole week early.
Whole week early, plus a bunch of other stuff.
Yes.
So to check that out. Tara, thank you so much for coaching me.
You're welcome.
I hope everybody enjoyed their CBT.
Bye.
Bye.